In this module, we're going to be discussing poetry and wisdom literature, which are, I think, two of the most interesting areas of the Old Testament. In particular, the wisdom literature is very thought-provoking, I think. Also this week, you'll notice your second paper is due. This is something new. I have never assigned this paper before, but I'm actually kind of excited about it. This is a contemporary art paper, which may seem like an odd thing to have in an Old Testament survey class. But the purpose of this paper is to get you to think about the kinds of social, political, philosophical, theological issues that the Old Testament addresses and how we're still asking a lot of those same questions. And the reason I put that in this particular session is because of the subject matter, the poetry and the wisdom, which really they overlap. Most of the wisdom literature is poetry as well. But to get you to see that biblical art, and let's call poetry is art, biblical art is not all that different from contemporary art. That the songs that we listen to, the movies that we watch, the books that we read, all of that, even the visual art that we look at, is speaking about the same sort of issues as the Old Testament. So for this assignment, I want you to choose some sort of contemporary art. It can be a song, it can be a movie, it could be really anything, anything artistic that you see speaking to an issue that is also addressed in the Old Testament. It doesn't have to be addressed in the wisdom literature or the Psalms. Or this week we're also going to be looking at Song of Solomon, which, by the way, is love poetry. So find a good love song, there's lots of them out there, and compare them with Song of Solomon or another text. Really, it's a very wide open assignment for you to do something creative that I think will help you to see the relevance of the Bible for today and make it maybe seem a little bit less strange and foreign and just kind of out there. So if you do have any questions about that assignment, please contact me. Just send me an email and I'll be happy to explain it a little bit more. But to start off in this video, I want to talk a little bit about Hebrew poetry. Now, for the poetry, the main example we would think of is the Book of Psalms, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. We'll also talk about Song of Solomon some, and there is a PowerPoint for Song of Solomon. I do not have a PowerPoint for the Psalms. There's really not a good way to approach the Psalms with a PowerPoint. It doesn't have a narrative structure, or traditionally hasn't been treated that way. We'll actually see that maybe some people argue that there is something of a narrative to it. So we'll discuss that without a PowerPoint, but for Song of Solomon I do have one. The biggest thing to know about Hebrew poetry is that it's rather different from English poetry. Hebrew poetry doesn't typically rhyme. It's not like Dr. Seuss. You do get some of the same sort of poetic literary features, such as alliteration, which is the repeated consonant sounds like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, that's alliteration, or assonance, which is repeated vowel sounds, so how, now, brown cow, that's assonance. You do get those in the Psalms, however, only in Hebrew. These were written in Hebrew, so it doesn't carry across into English. The poetry that's there is not as easy to detect in English translation. We do have other things like metaphor or simile, or some psalms are acrostics, meaning that they spell something, or maybe they go through the alphabet. So the first word of this verse will begin with, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Aleph. And the next verse will begin with Bet, which is the second letter, and it'll go through the alphabet. So they do those kinds of things, or chiasm, which is sort of parallel ideas. But the main feature of Hebrew poetry is what we call parallelism. Parallelism is the repetition of ideas, basically. Think about things that are parallel. You say something, and then you say it again in slightly different words. Now, it's not absolute parallelism. Very rarely is Hebrew poetry simply saying the same thing twice. It's usually going to add a little something. It might be more detail. It might go a little bit further. So, for example, let's see, in the book of Amos. So one of the things we'll see when we get to the prophets is that the prophets are mostly in poetry as well. Prophetic oracles are poetic. But the prophet Amos has a refrain that he uses over and over: for 3 sins of Israel and for 4 I will not relent. That's parallel, right? For 3 sins and for 4. It adds something. It's a little bit further. It's like 2 steps and then 3 steps. But oftentimes it'll seem very, very similar. For example, in Psalm 1, it begins with, "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers." You get 3 lines there that are saying roughly the same thing. Blessed is what kind of person? Well, a person who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked, who doesn't stand in the path of sinners, and who doesn't sit in the seat of scoffers. Those are 3 different metaphors for describing the same type of behavior. Basically, a righteous person, someone who does not go along with sin, who doesn't associate with sinners, who doesn't participate in their deeds, is the person who's blessed. But it says it could just come out and say, blessed is the person who does not sin, or the person who keeps pure. But it doesn't have the same punch to it as this parallelism, this saying it over and over again. So that's the main feature we find in Hebrew poetry. So the Psalms, if you're ever reading through the Psalms and you're thinking, these seem really repetitive, they're really redundant, like just saying the same thing over and over. Yes, that's how Hebrew poetry works. Now, it's not always going to be that strong. There's actually a debate among scholars about whether or not there really is a hard and fast distinction between Hebrew poetry and Hebrew prose. There are some psalms that are very prose-like, and there are also some narrative texts that are very poetic. But in general, I think we can say that yes, we do find a different type of language here than we find in, say, Deuteronomy or 1 Samuel, and a lot of that is the parallelism. So much for sort of the literary nature of Hebrew poetry. What about the book of Psalms? All right, so Psalms is 150 poems. And it's different from the other books that we've looked at. It does not have a clear narrative structure. It's not telling a story, at least not one on the surface. Each psalm seems to stand alone. You could think of the book of Psalms as being like a hymnal. If you go to a church that has a book of songs that they sing from, that's roughly what the book of Psalms was. It's a collection of hymns that could be sung on various occasions. Now, we have it as poetry because we don't have the music that went along with it. We do find some musical terms in it. Some of the beginnings of the Psalms will name a tune, or they'll say, it's to be played on this instrument, or it's for the choir director. You'll find embedded in some of the Psalms the term Selah, which we don't really know for sure what it means, but it may mean something like pause, or take a break, or meditate upon it. It may be an instrumental interlude. Now, one of the main ways that scholars have studied the Psalms in over the past 100 years or so is to try to assign them to different genres. So again, think about the Psalms not as poems necessarily, but as originally being songs. And of course, we have different genres of music, different genres of songs. Sometimes that's based on musical style, right? So we've got, alternative and R&B and hip hop and country, and those are musical styles. But then we also have genres that are based on content and on themes. So there are some songs that would be appropriate to sing or to play at a wedding, and there are some songs that would not be appropriate, right? So, the one I think of is, it's kind of old now, I guess, but Carrie Underwood's song "Before He Cheats." If you played that song at a wedding, that would raise eyebrows, right? That would mean something unless it was a joke. But that's a breakup song versus other types of songs that would be more appropriate for that setting. There are some songs that would be appropriate at a funeral or at a birthday party. You don't go to a funeral and start singing "Happy Birthday." All right, that makes sense. Same thing with the Psalms, is that they address different situations and are appropriate in different situations. And this approach is called form criticism. Now, form criticism, it sounds deceptive, right? It sounds like you're interested in, the form, right? The shape. It's not about shape. It is about, in German, the form, the Gattung is what it's called, is the genre. And so there was a scholar named Hermann Gunkel who he actually was inspired by life sciences, by botany in particular. Carl Linnaeus's classification system for plants and animals, kingdom, phylum, order, genus, all that. He said, "Wait, what if we could do something like that for biblical texts?" And he studied comparative mythology, folklore from from Norse mythology, and so there were different types of tales, different legends and myths that suited different occasions. And so he applied that to the Bible, not only to the Psalms. He also did this with Genesis, and people have done it with the Gospels. You could do it with any text, but it's been particularly successful with studying the Psalms because of their standalone character. That we can very clearly see Psalms are addressed to different types of situations. So, for example, if we return to Psalm 1, which was the one I read a little bit from a minute ago, we'll notice some definite themes here, right? "Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season. Its leaf does not wither, and in whatever it does he prospers. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff which wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." So if you were to try to think, and it's something I do when I teach this class on campus, is I tend to break the students up into groups and assign them different psalms and say, okay, so I want you to kind of classify this, right? So who seems to be the speaker in this psalm? Who seems to be, what seems to be the tone? Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they angry? What do they say about God? Where is God in this psalm? And then finally, if you could choose one or two words to categorize this psalm, what would you choose? In this psalm, you would say, well, it seems to be teaching a lot, right? It's talking a lot about the right way to live versus the wrong way to live. It talks about meditating on the law of the Lord. It talks about how God prospers the righteous, but he punishes the wicked. So you put all that together, you get a psalm that is laying down a worldview in which righteous behavior is rewarded, wicked behavior is punished, and God is the just judge. We call this a wisdom psalm. So one of the things we'll see in the next video on wisdom literature is that this is a common wisdom theme. What is the right way to live, and how can you live so that you'll be prosperous? And so the idea that God is just, or maybe not. Some of the wisdom texts question that, but that's a wisdom perspective. So we would call this a wisdom psalm. But we have other psalms that are very different. For example, another one that I like to assign is Psalm 137. Listen to this psalm and see how very different it is from Psalm 1. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion. Upon the willows in the midst of it we hung our harps. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, how blessed will be the one who repays you with the recompense with which you have repaid us. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Now, this is quite different. This psalm ends with wishing a blessing upon those who murder Babylonian children. But the whole psalm has a very somber tone. They're sitting down by the rivers of Babylon and weeping. They're being tormented by their captors. They're remembering the destruction of Jerusalem. So this psalm is written out of the Babylonian exile. And it's mourning. It's a lament. So that's the genre we would use. This is what's called a communal lament. It's not one person. It's the whole community lamenting, mourning the destruction of Jerusalem. And it ends with what we call an imprecation, a curse, wishing ill upon other people. We find these throughout the Psalms, wishing for God to punish their enemies. So this is a very different type of song. And you can imagine very different settings for these psalms. Just like, some songs would be appropriate at a wedding, some songs would not. Same thing. And that's really the goal of form criticism. It was to determine what they called the Sitzim Leben, or the setting in life. What is the situation in life in which it would be appropriate to use this psalm? Now, it really was dictated by the genre, right? It wasn't about the individual psalm, it was about the genre. Laments belong in a time of crisis. Wisdom songs perhaps belong in a school setting, or maybe in the temple, on the mouths of priests, their religious instruction. We have what are called royal psalms, psalms that are meant to support the monarchy, encourage people to obey them. We have what are called enthronement psalms, which don't confuse us with royal psalms because they're very similar, but in an enthronement psalm, God is the king. They say, the Lord is king, or the Lord reigns. And they're actually perhaps meant to replace the monarchy altogether and say, we don't need a human king. We have God. God is our king. So all these different genres of psalms. And form criticism has been kind of the main way that psalms have been studied for most of the past century, until fairly recently, the last few decades, really starting from about the 1980s on. There's been another approach as well. And so I mentioned that traditionally we don't think of the Psalms as having a narrative, having a story to them, but there actually are some scholars who think that they do have one. And this is what we call canonical criticism. A canonical approach to the Bible is interested not in each individual psalm in its own right, but in the whole, the arrangement of the psalms. Why are they put in the order that they are? Because one of the things we find is that there seem to be collections of psalms. There's a whole section of them that are all attributed to a guy named Asaph. So we call that the Asaphite Psalter, a collection of psalms that were all written by this same person. We find a whole collection of 42 psalms that all use the name Elohim for God instead of Yahweh. So we call that the Elohistic Psalter. We find, especially toward the beginning, about the first third of the book of Psalms, first half really, is mostly Davidic psalms, psalms of David. But then suddenly they disappear toward the end, or kind of the middle part. They disappear, and then David comes back. Well, why are these psalms being put in the places that they are? Why is Psalm 1 at the beginning, the psalm that is all about wisdom and how to live? The last 5 psalms seem to have a common theme. They all are calls to worship. They all are saying hallelujah, which means praise the Lord. They all begin with that. They all begin and end with praise the Lord. And then the last one ends with a whole bunch of them. Just this chorus of praise the Lord. So some scholars have argued that the Psalms are arranged in a particular way. And one scholar named Gerald Wilson looked in particular at the seams between the 5 books of the Psalter. See, the book of Psalms is actually not one book. It's actually 5 books. You'll notice if you're reading along that at key places you might see something that says, book 2 or book 3. So for example, if you were to look at Psalm 41, at the very end of Psalm 41, you may see something that says book 2. And then again, if you go to Psalm 72, at the end it says, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. And then you'll see book 3. And suddenly, in book 3, there aren't Davidic psalms. Now we get into the Asaphite psalms. And David disappears. Why? Well, because the book of the prayers of the son of David, son of Jesse, have ended. So he looked at these seams, and he looked at the superscriptions, the authorial attributions, and said, why are these psalms arranged the way they are? It's the first 2 books are almost entirely Davidic psalms. But then David suddenly disappears in book 3. In fact, if you look at the last psalm of book 2, Psalm 72 is not attributed to David, it's to Solomon. And if you read through it, it seems to deal with issues from Solomon's life about wisdom and how to rule. And so, and then David disappears in book 3, and then he's gone in book 4, and then he comes back in book 5. Well, here's what Wilson argued. He argued that it's telling the story of the monarchy, the story of ancient Israel. That the first 2 books are meant to tell the story of David and the rise of the Davidic monarchy. Lots of things in there that seem to be tied to specific episodes in David's life, like when he's hiding from Saul. And then book 3 seems to be the end of the Davidic monarchy. Remember the loss of most of the Israelite tribes by the Davidic dynasty. So he argued that this is the divided kingdom after Solomon, that the kingdom split. And then it ends, Psalm 89 is the last psalm in book 3, ends with asking a question. It asks, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? Will your wrath burn like fire? It asks, where is your former loving kindness, O Lord, which you swore to David in your faithfulness? It's asking, did God break his covenant with David? In fact, it recalls that. It says, you swore to David, his descendants will endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. But then it says, but you have cast off and rejected. You have been full of wrath against your anointed. In fact, it says, you have spurned the covenant of your servant. It's asking, why did God allow the Davidic monarchy to fall? Didn't he promise David an eternal dynasty? Well, what's happened? Because the monarchy ended with the Babylonian exile. So it's asking a theological question. You could imagine these first 3 books being put together in the Babylonian exile to tell the story of the rise and fall of the monarchy and to ask a theological question. Where is God? Why did God let this happen to us? Well, then he says book 4 and book 5 offer different responses to that. Book 4, starting in Psalm 90, is attributed to Moses, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Well, that's interesting. Moses. And in this collection, we find a lot of enthronement psalms. Again, those psalms that celebrate God as being king. So what Wilson argued is that this is a response to the fall of the monarchy, is to say, there was a time when Israel had kings. There was a time, the time of Moses, the pre-monarchic period, when God was king. And we need to return to that. The monarchy was a failure. So let's make God our king again. Perhaps this reflects priestly rule, which is what we have after the Babylonian exile. And then finally, book 5 begins with Psalm 107. And here, in book 5, we do start to find more Davidic psalms, that David comes back. But we also find a lot of wisdom psalms here. Psalms about Torah, obeying the Torah as being the secret of life. So maybe this is another response, is to say Torah obedience. The reason the monarchy failed was because they disobeyed the Torah. They broke the covenant. So here's how we should go forward. And maybe God will even restore the monarchy. Again, David comes back. There's maybe a hint of messianism here. So you put that together, and what Wilson argued is that actually there is a narrative structure, that the Psalms are arranged to tell a story. That's the story of the history of ancient Israel. Now, not everyone is convinced of this, but I do think that there is something to it. So that's another way of approaching the Psalms. Now, the other book of poetry that I do want to mention briefly is the Song of Solomon. Now, again, there's a lot of poetry in the Old Testament. Most of the prophets are poetic. The wisdom literature is poetic. But Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs as it is sometimes, actually the Hebrew title is actually Song of Songs, stands apart because it seems so very unreligious. This is a book that is, it's poetry. It's love poetry. It's called Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, or the very best song in Hebrew. And traditionally has been attributed to Solomon, because it does say the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, which belonged to Solomon. May mean it was written by Solomon, may mean it's inspired by Solomon. Remember that Solomon was a famous lover. He had 1,000 women. And so he seems to be the character here. He's sort of, the Casanova of ancient Israel, so it's inspired by him. But that may be a late addition. It may be that that Solomon is sort of the character here, not that he actually wrote the psalm, or wrote the song. Now this is short; it's only 8 chapters, but I didn't want to leave it out because it is so different, and I think will be very relevant when you're working on your contemporary art papers, because it addresses the very human things, love and romance and sexuality are all dealt with here. It's not it's not Sunday school. All right. Some scholars actually believe that it may have been written by a woman, that there may be a female poet here because the female perspective dominates. Now, this book kind of alternates back and forth from the woman speaking to the man speaking, but the female perspective is the dominant one. So maybe that means it was written by a woman and from her perspective. Maybe even fighting against social norms, that women are to receive love, not to give it, and this book pushes back against that. On the other hand, erotic literature has traditionally targeted men. It's traditionally written by men for men, but maybe not. 50 Shades of Grey was written by a woman. So, what exactly is going on here, but this is a very different type of book. It is a collection of poems. It's not a single poem. It's a collection of individual poems that are grouped together thematically. You could even call it an erotic or a love-themed psalter, all united by this common theme of romance. And there is something of a running narrative, a drama here, going across this book, the love story of the man and woman as it develops, and so we see that as well. Now, in the history of interpretation, this book has been very controversial, and I think you can understand why. It doesn't really deal with God. God is mentioned, but it's not in telling you how to live righteously. It's about human things. It's about love. It's about sexuality. And so throughout the history of interpretation, Jews and Christians have debated about whether or not this book should be in the Bible, and if so, how should it be interpreted. One early rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, said, "Whoever sings the Song of Songs with a tremulous voice in a banquet hall, and so treats it as a sort of ditty, has no share in the world to come." So he actually kind of argued against taking this book lightly, that it wasn't just a love song. It shouldn't just be sung in a banquet hall. Um, but then also speaking about whether or not it belongs in the Bible, he said, if to those who would say that it shouldn't be in the Bible, he said, God forbid, no man in Israel ever disputed about the Song of Songs, that he should say that it does not render the hands unclean. In other words, that this is a dirty book, that it's illicit. For all the ages are not worth the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. So he actually had a lot of respect for this book. But why? Well, mostly it's because most interpreters throughout history have not read this book literally. Now, that's not the way most scholars today read it, but most interpreters, both Jewish and Christian, throughout history have read it allegorically. And I've got a long list from Rabbi Akiva, Hippolytus, Origen, Jerome, all the way down to fairly recently with Martin Luther and John Wesley, Wesley being in the 18th century, of Jews and Christians who all treated this book as an allegory, that it was symbolic. Not that it's not describing a literal man and woman, but it's an allegory about the relationship between God and God's people, whether that be Israel or the church. And in fact, we do have those sorts of allegories in the Bible. We'll see in the prophetic texts, in Ezekiel and some other texts, that Israel is sometimes portrayed as God's wife. In Hosea, for example, she's the unfaithful wife of God. And so they would say, well, this song is a metaphor, it's allegory. It's not really about a man and a woman. It's about God and Israel. And so all of the romance stuff needs to be understood as allegorical, not literal, not physical stuff. On the other hand, in more recent times, in modern times, from about 1850 onward, the literal interpretation has been dominant. That is because we have plenty of ancient Near Eastern parallels to this book. We find now that it actually does belong to a whole genre, that we have Babylonian and Assyrian and Egyptian love poems that are very, very similar to this book. And so if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If Song of Songs looks like, sounds like all of these other love poems, that's probably what it is. So the ancient Near Eastern parallels, even in Arabic, there's I'm not good at pronouncing this word, but wasf, I think is how it's pronounced, is very similar to this as well. There were some early interpreters, like Theodore of Mopsuestia, who argued that this book was literal. It was about an actual man and woman. And then, interestingly, John Calvin, the 16th century Christian reformer, read this book literally as well. So, if we go with a literal interpretation, then we're back at the question, why is this book in the Bible? Well, perhaps it's to legitimate the human. Is to say that sexuality is not bad, it's not sinful. It's part of being human, and God created it. God, go back to Genesis 1. God created them male and female. That this is God ordained, and so that in the proper parameters, it can be a very holy thing. And so that's another approach as well, to take it literally. And I tend more toward the literal side, although you could see an allegorical dimension to it as well, insofar as every marriage is a metaphor for the relationship between God and God's people. Finally, some recent literal approaches argue that there's a drama. So a scholar named Ian Provan argues that there's a love triangle here, that there are three characters, the man, the woman, and Solomon, and that there's a drama, it's like a soap opera going on here. Others, Tremper Longman argues that it's an anthology, that it's a collection of independent psalms. So again, the idea of the erotic psalter. That is not a single story, but it's an anthology of independent love poems. There are even some scholars who argue that it has a cultic function to it, that in the ancient Near East there were sacred marriage rituals that would take place between a priest and a priestess, and that was to represent the marriage between a god and a goddess. That's problematic in Israel because we have monolatry and then eventually monotheism. So that's unlikely, but perhaps in early times it could have been taken that way. Some even argue that it is associated with death. Marvin Pope argued that it was part of a funerary cult. There's something called the Marzeach. We find this in some Canaanite texts, and it's mentioned a few times in the Old Testament as well, as a house of mourning, but a house of not only mourning but also mirth. That perhaps at funerals they would have a big party, and maybe this song was a part of it. But a lot of mystery about this book, but I wanted to include that just real briefly because that is another type of poetry that we find in the Old Testament.